Welcome back to my channel, The Masked Mormon. I am, in fact, the Masked Mormon.
Why are you wearing a mask? Were you burned by acid or something like that?
Oh no, it's just they're terribly comfortable. I think everyone will be wearing them in the future.
Hello. If you're new here, I am a Mormon who believed in the church for some 20-odd years. And now I explore some of the falsifiable and strange claims of Mormonism. If you're returning, I'm glad you could come back. Because you saw the thumbnail and clicked on this video, you know what I'm going to talk about. Now, I've been thinking about whether the Mormon Church is a cult for quite some time. I know several of you will have some pretty strong feelings on one side or the other. Some of you will say it is 100% a cult. On the other hand, some of you may say that there's no way that the church is a cult. Well, let's explore this question a little, shall we? So what is a cult? That word may conjure up images of Jim Jones and the People's Temple. This destructive cult resulted in the deaths by murder and suicide of 918 people, including infants and children. This is where the phrase, drinking the Kool-Aid, comes from. That word might also conjure up images of the Branch Davidians, led by David Koresh, and resulted in the deaths of 76 people due to an FBI raid. I remember watching the news reports about this and even talking about it in class when I was in 5th grade. Some might even think of the Heaven's Gate cult, led by Marshall Applewhite. This cult believed that they would meet an alien spaceship that was behind the comet Hale-Bopp as it passed by Earth in 1997. This resulted in the suicide of 39 people. Now, these are some pretty extreme and horrifying examples, but cults have probably been with humanity since forever. Though often associated with religion, cults can be formed around any type of ideology. There can be political cults like QAnon, racial cults like the Klan, doomsday cults like the above-mentioned horrifying examples. In a broad sense, a cult is a group that is characterized by its unusual beliefs or interests associated with a personality, an object, or some goal. Well, let's be frank. That really isn't a helpful definition. It seems overly broad. Almost anything that a group of people do together could be lumped into that definition. What I want is a solid definition of what a cult is, so that we can determine whether or not the Mormon Church is a cult. Ideally, something that is objective and not dependent on emotions or other squishy criteria. In the Supreme Court decision, Jacob Ellis versus Ohio in 1964, in describing obscenity in film, Justice Potter Stewart said, "I know it when I see it." Now, this sort of fallacious thinking occurs when somebody is trying to categorize something that lacks clearly defined parameters. In talking about cults, there are some groups that very clearly are. But where is the line between obvious and less obvious? With that in mind, I have been going over what I wanted to say about Mormonism for a while. In fact, I thought about rewriting this whole video because some things I have read and listened to in preparation for this video had me thinking pretty conclusively on one side. And then other things started me wavering toward the other side. A tool that might be able to help was developed by Steve Hassan. Hassan is an expert in mind control, cults, and other destructive organizations. Hassan himself was the victim of a cult, having been a member of a group colloquially known as the Moonies. Since then, Hassan has devoted his life to the study and understanding of mind control and undue influence. You can find information about Hassan's work at the Freedom of Mind Resource Center at freedomofmind.com. His work and the research of others into brainwashing and cognitive dissonance has resulted in something called the BITE model. BITE stands for behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotion control. These differing modes of control may be used in varying degrees by groups to change how participants interact and how they think. From the Freedom of Mind website, I pulled a list that describes each of these modes of control. I tried to organize and color code them as best I could. Yellow being some of the less obvious traits or things that are used by even non-cult groups. Orange is...
It's suggestive as hell.
And red is the golden snitch. Now, the golden snitch is from the fictional sport from Harry Potter of Quidditch. If somebody catches the golden snitch, they're awarded 150 points and automatically win the game. So a golden snitch characteristic would be 150 points, instant winner of the cult trophy. Now, these colors are based purely on my own subjective opinions. But let's go through some of the traits in each of the modes of mind control and see how the church does. First one is behavior control. Now, this can do things like control somebody's clothing or hairstyles. Now, this is something the church definitely does with its modesty rhetoric and its conservative nature as far as how it wants people to present hairstyles, as far as no extreme colors or and for men being kind of short. This sort of control can also dictate how and with whom members live or associate. Now, this is a little more softer. There's no overt dictating where members live. Members of the church kind of congregate where other members of the church live, but there's no hard and fast control there. These sorts of groups also regulate diet, food and drink, which, if anybody's read about the Mormon Word of Wisdom that prohibits certain substances like coffee, tea, alcohol, there's definitely that sort of control. And then also, with as demanding as the church is, there can be a restriction on what sorts of leisure and entertainment somebody does. Especially with one of its publications called For Strength of Youth, there can be a prohibition on things like rated R movies or quote-unquote inappropriate music. So there's definitely a lot of restriction of what somebody does, how they spend their time, because the church, frankly, is a very time-consuming organization. Now, into the more...
It's suggestive as hell.
...sort of things. These sorts of groups can regulate an individual's physical reality. So the Mormon worldview definitely molds how people view the world. These sorts of groups can also dictate how and with whom people have sex with. The Mormon law of chastity, limiting sex to heterosexual couples only in the bonds of marriage, is allowed. That's definitely a very strong push in Mormonism. There can be major time spent with group indoctrination or rituals. Anybody who's been to a Mormon church service can know how demanding that is on time, or even how much time and what is demanded for temple service. There can be a lot of discouragement of individualism and encouraging groupthink. Anybody who breaks outside of the norms or out of conformity is definitely looked at as somebody who might be a threat or somebody who shouldn't necessarily be trusted. There can be financial exploitation and manipulation. I've previously talked about tithing and how immoral I think that is, especially for poor people. There can be permission required for major decisions. There's a lot of counsel to people to talk to their bishop before making major life choices, like getting married, sometimes for even employment issues, for reproductive questions. There can definitely be a lot of push to talk to church authorities about what to do in those sort of situations. And these sorts of groups can instill dependency and obedience. Obedience is definitely harped on over and over in the church, especially obedience to the leaders. Obedience is the first law of heaven is something that's often quoted. And as far as some of the golden snitch things, behavior control can include threatening harm to family and friends, engaging in corporal punishment, separation of families, imprisonment, and these sorts of things. As far as behavior control goes, I I don't really see happening in the church as a organization. Some of the doctrines of the church definitely imply that if you don't obey, you will be separated from your family and friends forever. But it's definitely not a very hard, the church does these sorts of things. The next form of control is information control. Now, groups that engage in this will deliberately withhold information. Now, I think the church definitely takes the cake with that. It withholds any sorts of information that might be seen as unflattering or problematic and might draw people's testimonies away. In the same vein, it will distort information to make it more acceptable. It'll try to paint things like Joseph Smith's polygamy as something that was just for taking care of widows, or it was just for dynastic purposes, or ridiculous things like that. A lot of these things end up being things that are engaged in by the church's apologetic arm. And these sorts of groups will systematically lie to group members. They'll say, oh, we never taught that. There might be certain amounts of gaslighting that happened, or even things like, well, everybody else knew about that, but you didn't. There can also be extensive use of group-generated information and propaganda. These can be things like magazines, newspapers. The church definitely has its own magazine. It produces a lot of printed materials that are expected to be used solely because they are the authoritative sources from the church. Now, getting into the more serious sorts of things, they can minimize or discourage access to non-group sources of information. This can include internet sites, information that's critical of the group, discouraging talking to former members, and keeping members so busy that they don't really have time to think and investigate. Now, this is definitely something that the church does is really, really good at. It can engender a lot of mistrust for information that doesn't come from the church. It will oftentimes demonize former members and paint them as untrustworthy sources of information. And then the demands of the church often keep people so busy that they can't really stop to think about things. You know, they're busy with their families, with jobs, and then with the demands of church callings. You really don't have time to take a breath and look around. And so one of the things that's happened with COVID, I think, is it's allowed people to kind of stop and take a breath and look around and say, hey, things don't seem quite right. These sorts of groups will also compartmentalize information into outsider versus insider doctrines. And then they'll also ensure that information isn't freely available. And even information that was once accepted by the church but is fallen out of favor will be put down something called the memory hole, where they'll just stop talking about things and just say, well, we never taught that, or just kind of let people forget about it and just kind of move on quietly without addressing things that were very prominent teachings at one point, but then have fallen out of favor. And then these sorts of groups will also only allow leadership to decide who knows what and when. These are definitely things that that the church engages in. The only valid information is church-approved sources, and it definitely reins in what information is available. Now, some things that I don't think the church necessarily engages in as far as a hardcore thing is encouraging spying on members. Yes, in some sense, the church is a very closed group because the church group is kind of the main social group. There are a lot of eyes on people that can then end up reporting to church leaders what people are doing. So that might be definitely something that the church engages in. And then, though confession is definitely used in the church, and some of that information can be used to disrupt or dissolve boundaries. That's not something that's very general. There's a thing called leadership roulette. You'll have certain church leaders who will engage in these sorts of practices and others that won't. Because it's not a general thing, I have a hard time giving the golden snitch to some of these behaviors. That's not saying that these sorts of things don't happen. The third form of control is thought control. Now, groups that do these sorts of forms of control will encourage only good and proper thoughts. Now, this definitely happens with saying things like contention is of the devil, or bad thoughts are from Satan, good thoughts are from the Spirit. There's definitely good and proper thoughts. Not having sexual sorts of feelings or thoughts is definitely a big one as well. These sorts of groups can change a person's name and identity, which can definitely happen. Anybody who goes to a Mormon Church service, people are called brother and sister so-and-so, president so-and-so, elder so-and-so, especially in foreign countries. The predominant Utah culture tries to be transplanted and overpower any local sorts of identity. These sorts of groups require members to internalize the group's doctrine as truth. The Mormon plan of salvation definitely provides a map of reality and tries to substitute that as the reality. It'll has a sense of biblical literalism. The church is dependent on literal Adam and Eve, literal Noah's flood, literal Tower of Babel sorts of things. And they'll instill black and white thinking. It's either all good or all bad, nothing really in between. And they also decide between what's good and evil. Anything that God tells you to do is good. Anything that's not within the church bounds is evil. And this can definitely replace a person's own sense of moral authority. They organize people into us versus them, insiders versus outsiders. I know as a member of the church, as a convert, I eventually fell victim to this, even with my parents, as looking at them as outsiders and people that didn't believe, and so they didn't have special access to certain forms of information. And that's definitely one thing I'm very ashamed of that I fell victim to. They'll also use loaded language and cliches that constrict knowledge and stop critical thoughts. Say things like doubt your doubts, or stay in the boat, where will you go? Those sorts of things kind of stop people in their tracks and kind of terminate any sort of critical thinking. Some of these things that are listed aren't necessarily done. Yes, there's praying, yes, there's singing things, there's definitely wishful thinking. But it's more done in the things that people say. Contention is of the devil. Anything that if people start to be critical of anything about the church, they'll say things that stop people from being critical. These sorts of groups, as far as golden snitch sorts of control, will use hypnotic techniques that will alter mental states and undermine critical thinking. Now, this one might not seem as obvious, but these can be things like singing or meditation, or in the case of the church, if you've been to a church service, you will realize how boring it is. And that's actually a feature, not a bug. Church services are meant to be boring to kind of get you to introspect, to turn and look at some of your feelings, and will kind of put you into a sort of hypnotic or somewhat suggestive sort of frame of mind. These sorts of groups will also do things that undermine any sort of critical thinking or even age regress the member. There's a lot of infantilization that happens with church members. There's a pamphlet that the church puts out called For Strength of Youth that kind of dictates what young people are allowed and not allowed to do, but that also gets applied to adults. And even adults that are unmarried have a lot of restrictions placed on them by the church that prevents them from doing certain things or hanging out with certain people, because the church is so afraid of sexual immorality that it will infantilize even adults until they get married, and then there's a continued infantilization because there's a limitation on how much information is provided and things like that. There can be a manipulation of memories, and false memories are created. The narratives of the church definitely do this as far as changing how stories are told. Some of the stories at General Conference are told differently because they go from something that was pretty mundane to something that becomes miraculous. There's definitely a rejection of rational analysis and critical thinking or constructive criticism. Dallin H. Oakes, a member of the governing body of the church, has said before that criticism of church leaders is wrong, even if the criticism is true. And that leads into forbidding critical questions about leader, doctrine, or policy. There's definitely a lot of that happens. So I definitely think, as far as thought control, the Mormon Church definitely engages in everything down to golden snitch sort of traits. Finally comes emotion control. Now with emotion control, there can be manipulation on the range of feelings that are appropriate to feel. Some emotions are deemed good, others are deemed evil or wrong or selfish, and these can be things like anger are definitely things that are looked down upon. Contention, sexual thoughts are definitely things that are to be avoided, whereas things like being happy and being calm and just being agreeable are things that are very much encouraged in Mormonism. There's also emotion stopping techniques that block feelings. Forget yourself and go to work are things that are often said to missionaries. These sorts of things are to help kind of stamp down anger or homesickness or doubt. And they make the person feel like the problems are their own fault. There's a lot of something called victim blaming, where everything is always the member's fault. If something's going wrong, they don't have enough faith. If they are sick, they don't have enough faith to be healed. All sorts of things are your own fault. You didn't read enough. You didn't pray enough. You didn't do whatever enough. You're never enough. There's definitely a lot of that happens in the church. And there can also be a lot of feelings of guilt and unworthiness, especially with youth. There's a lot of sexual guilt. There's a lot of guilt that you're not living up to your potential. You're a priesthood leader, or you're a woman who doesn't want to do the church prescribed path of reality, and you're not living up to your full potential. Any thoughts and feelings that are your own are thought as irrelevant or selfish, and even your own accomplishments are often not your own. God often gets the credit for those accomplishments, or anything that's bad that happens in your life is because Satan has control over you. These sorts of groups can also instill fear about thinking independently or about the outside world. There's definitely a lot of that. People will often refer to the church's handbooks or general conference talks to try to make major life decisions. There's also a lot of fear of losing one's salvation. If somebody doesn't live up to their temple covenants, they can be in danger of losing their salvation and also losing being with their family. And so there's definitely a lot of that happens in the church. Now, some of the things, this next section is an encouragement of confessing sins to priesthood leaders, but public confession is something that's definitely not encouraged. Again, I think that goes more towards some of the above emotion control of manipulating a range of feelings. If people are sharing their own sins, those aren't happy sorts of things. And so as a system, that doesn't really happen. There can definitely be messages, and this kind of happens in both directions. Some church leaders will say that you can find happiness and fulfillment outside the church, but others will say that there's no happiness or fulfillment. There's no happiness or fulfillment outside the church, or they'll say that there's terrible consequences if you leave. There's no hard shunning that happens in the church. It's more, again, soft, more informal, where if you're not attending church, you're kind of out of people's mind, because again, they're so busy, they don't really have time to think about you if you're not there in front of them. Or things like not allowing their children to play with your children if you've left the church. And again, those things are not encouraged, but they kind of just happen. So I have a hard time giving golden snitch to this, because you kind of have things on both sides in the church. And maybe that's one of the other ways of kind of controlling, of thought control. The church will talk out of both sides of its mouth. So that can be a little harder to definitely award a golden snitch to. Okay, I know that was a lot of information, and hopefully it was good, and hopefully by me kind of putting that up on the screen, it kind of helped you think about it, and hopefully if you agree with me, great. If not, definitely leave a comment and let me know. Because again, like I said, this is kind of subjective, and this is kind of from my own experience. I know other people will have other experiences. But going through that, we can definitely see that the church seems to tick a lot of those boxes. Or again, in the words of George Carlin,
It's suggestive as hell.
or in a visual form, here's the bite model, kind of with some of those color bars, and kind of how I evaluated things based on kind of what we went through. The church definitely resides very much in the orange section, and in the thought control section, it definitely moves into the red culty sort of territory. But it's still kind of hard to definitively call the church a cult. It definitely has culty tendencies, and it moves close to golden snitch territory in some categories. But when I take what the church does and compare it to other organizations that aren't considered cults, I can also see similar behavior. Is my color coding even correct? Should there be some sort of scoring or sliding scale that can be used to evaluate the cultiness of an organization? As a scientist and engineer, I want a way to evaluate and measure. Certain criteria are developed and a way to score those criteria that can push the pointers. If an organization does A, B, C, and D, then does it accumulate enough points to be classified as a cult? If an organization is fully into the red zone on thought control and yellow or orange everywhere else, does it in fact take the golden snitch of cultiness? In August 2006, the International Astronomical Union created an official definition for the term planet. Before that time, the definition was pretty soft, and it could have included any number of asteroids in the asteroid belt, and also a number of objects beyond Neptune. The new definition said that in order to be considered a planet, an object must do three things. The first is orbit the sun. Okay, makes sense. It must be massive enough to be rounded out by its own gravity. It has to be spherical. And then the third thing is it must have cleared its own orbital neighborhood of other objects. That third criteria resulted in the definition reclassifying Pluto as a dwarf planet.
Whoop-de-doo! What does it all mean, Basil?
So what I'm trying to get at is when comparing the church to other similar groups that may or may not be considered cults, the distinction becomes a little less clear. Is the military a cult? Are other religions a cult? Are countries cults? I think there needs to be a harder definition of a cult, with a means of methodologically evaluating the group's characteristics to determine whether it is a cult. So, is the Mormon Church a cult? Now, I've gone back and forth on this over the last couple of weeks. I listened to Steve Hassan interview John DeLynn on Hassan's podcast, and Hassan seems convinced that the church is in fact a cult. But in the same vein, DeLynn often tries to avoid calling the church a cult because he finds that it can be somewhat counterproductive to his stated goals. So my answer is maybe. Some of you will have had golden snitch experiences that will lay the church firmly into the cult camp. And I recognize and I honor those experiences. Others will have had largely benign experiences, though it can be argued that no one really has a benign experience with the church. So it's less clear. I think the People's Temple, Heaven's Gate, and the Branch Davidian were very clearly cults, and not healthy to anyone who participated. Can the church be a healthy place for some people? Yes. Though I can see how that could be debatable, especially if truth actually matters. The church gave me a strong community, but it also required me to turn off my own critical thinking. Could organizations start out as cults and then over time become healthy organizations? Perhaps. Like a harder definition for a cult, there should maybe be a continuum to determine how healthy or harmful an organization is. Based on certain criteria, which people more knowledgeable than me can determine, an organization can be considered healthy, medium demand, high demand, cult, or destructive cult. Perhaps an organization can move along the continuum over time in either direction. Even if the question of whether the Mormon Church is a cult or not can at times be a little ambiguous, one thing is for certain: the structure and culture of the church is an ideal environment for all sorts of abuse to be fostered. I think the most egregious thing it does is claiming to speak for God. No group should have that dynamic because it sets up a system for abuse and corruption. Does the church obfuscate and hide information? Yes. Does the church have a preoccupation with leader worship? Oh, for sure. Does the church hide sexual impropriety? Definitely. There's a lot that the church does that appears to be culty. But do other similar organizations that are generally not considered cults have similar types of corruption? Yes. In a vacuum, the answer seems clear. But there are other organizations that seem just as, if not more culty, yet have cultural acceptance. I am looking at evangelical Christianity. The church is still young. 200 years ago, the abuses of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and other leaders were reprehensible. But over time, even with some modern retrenchments, the church has been trying to become considered a mainstream religion. It has been becoming less extreme. Compared to where it started, it's still a very high-demand organization and has a long way to go. But how does that help people who are suffering in the church now and don't have another 200 or even 2,000 years to wait for the church to become healthy? Well, maybe you can take some of the things we talked about and figure out your own personal criteria. Maybe in talking about the bite model, you can determine where those cutoffs are for you. At the very least, it can help you to become more aware of the organizations you are a part of, not just the church. And again, maybe you can use the continuum idea and use it to evaluate your relationship with the church and other organizations. But that said, ultimately, like a better definition for a planet, I think there needs to be a better definition for determining an organization's cultiness. More than just, I know it when I see it. Now, I realize this might not be as satisfying as an enthusiastic, yes, the church is a cult. It is at the very least a high-demand organization. But what are your thoughts? Leave a comment below. If you like what I do, press that subscribe button, and I will see you again.